turn your eyes to the screen, I want to introduce you to Baarack. He's an interesting looking fellow, isn't he? Well, back in 2021, in a place called Lancefield, which is about an hour north of Melbourne, some farmers found this sheep and they called him Baarack. He'd been wandering in the bush for many years, meaning, as you can see, his wool had never been shorn. It weighed, the wool, over 35 kilograms. It completely covered his eyes. He was completely blind, and he was weighed down so badly that when he was found, he was barely walking and struggled to eat. Grass seeds were lodged in his eyes. He was the very definition of a lost sheep. When they caught him and figured out how to get him out of the hole he was in or wherever he'd wandered off to, they sheared him and he was transformed. I got a picture of Sean Baarack. There he is. And it's astonishing transformation. That heavy, matted 35 kilograms of wool came off in one giant piece, and suddenly he could see, he could move. The weight he was carrying was gone. He went from merely surviving to thriving, and he lived happily forever after in a farm sanctuary an hour north of Melbourne. You can take Baarack away. He was lost and in trouble, free to roam, free to enjoy whatever he could find in the bush, but far from thriving. In fact, I think it's a great picture of you and me. Because each of us, before we meet Jesus, our good shepherd, we likewise might think that we're free and happy and can do whatever we like. But in actuality, we're weighed down, blind, stumbling through life on our own, in our own mess, barely walking, thinking we're thriving. And yet in the darkness, Jesus enters and calls us out. And so we're going to think, as we heard in our reading today from John chapter 10, about what it means for Jesus to be our good shepherd, the one who calls each of us when we're like Baarack, lost, burdened and broken, out of that life and into his fold. But before we dive into that, it's important that we get the context of the reading we've got before us today. And in the context, back in chapter 9, Jesus heals a blind man. And this blind man goes and shows himself to the Pharisees, who we know in John's Gospel are very much not on Team Jesus. And the Pharisees ask him, "Who gave you your sight?" And they're accusing him. They're saying, you're trying to tell us it's Jesus, but it's not Jesus. It can't be Jesus. He's a bad guy. He's a sinner. And the blind man replies to them in verse 25 of chapter 9, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." And when the Pharisees continue to press this blind man and say to them, no, you must be mistaken, he says to them, "Hey, you're asking a lot of questions about Jesus and my healing, and is that because you want to become one of his disciples too?" And that doesn't go down very well, it's fair to say. Verse 27-28, "I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become one of his disciples too?" What do? They hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciples. We are disciples of Moses." Now, this whole story that unfolds in chapter 9, where this man's healed from his physical blindness, John uses that to show that actually the true problem is not physical blindness, but spiritual. And the story in chapter 9 exposes us and shows us that the Pharisees are blind spiritual guides. They claim to be the leaders of God's people, and yet here it is, this newly healed blind man, considered by all as a sinner. He's got more clarity about who God is and who Jesus is as his Messiah than the Pharisees, the so-called leaders, the so-called experts in God's business. They're blind guides, leading the people astray as they don't point them to Jesus. And so it's in the aftermath of this miracle and having experienced this contrast between the sight, both physically and spiritually, of the blind man versus the blindness of the Pharisees, that we get our reading in chapter 10. And addressing the Pharisees here in chapter 10, Jesus uses this shepherd and sheep pen analogy to contrast how he's going to lead God's people versus how the Pharisees have been doing it. And it's important, as we kind of consider what Jesus says here, that we get our heads around the context. Jesus is using a very, for them, first century modern day example to try and explain to them what the Pharisees are like and what he's like as a leader of God's people. Because sheep farming was very common in the first century agricultural economy of Israel. But it was very different to Australian sheep farming. You might have some familiarity with it. I used to have a mate who farmed sheep in the Derwent Valley when I was at school. We used to drive out to his sheep on a ute, and there were lots of sheep, and it was a very big exercise. And that was a small sheep farm compared to some of the bigger ones that we have throughout Australia. In the first century, what they would do is they would have these communal pens where several different smaller flocks would be herded for safety at night. Each flock would have a shepherd, and the shepherd would kind of hire these pens as a place to keep their sheep safe at night so they could get some rest before they take their sheep out again during the day. At night, they would have a guard who was hired collectively by the different shepherds who had wanted to leave their sheep in this pen. And so if you wanted to do some sheep stealing, there would be someone to try and get in your way. So you'd have to sneak in over the side because of this guard who was at the front. Every morning, the shepherds would turn up and they would call their sheep out to them. And the flock would be assembled. And of course, you've got to remember, these are intermingling sheep, different shepherds, and the shepherds were able to sort of reorganise them simply by calling. So that would have been something that a lot of people were familiar with. It's a common practice of how they did shepherding and sheep farming in the first century. So it's a very vivid picture in their minds as Jesus explains this picture that we have before us in chapter 10. But there's also not just the reality of the sheep farming in their minds, but the scriptural context into which Jesus speaks too, because these first century Jews are Old Testament people, and they know the way the Old Testament speaks of sheep and shepherds and God and his people. So, for example, in Psalm chapter 80, verse 1, "Hear us, shepherd of Israel, you who lead Joseph like a flock." Or in Isaiah 40, verse 11, "God tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that have young." All flocks need a leader, and the shepherd God was meant to be the shepherd of God's people. But the problem that keeps happening in the Old Testament is false shepherds keep coming in and ruining the flock, leading them astray. And so we read in places like Isaiah 56 verses 9 to 12, Jeremiah 23 verses 1 to 4 and 25 verses 32 to 38 and Zechariah 11 of Old Testament false shepherds who lead God's people astray. But there's one other place that's really key, and I think in informing what Jesus is talking about here, and that's Ezekiel chapter 34, which is a key piece of scripture that informs the context as to what Jesus says here in John 10. And so, interrupting today's sermon, I'm going to get Susan to come up and read to us Ezekiel chapter 34, and then we'll keep going. Thanks, Susan.
The word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, This is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because my flock lacks a shepherd, and so has been plundered and has become food for all the wild animals, and because my shepherds did not search for my flock, but cared for themselves rather than for my flock, therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against the shepherds and will hold them accountable for my flock. I will remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them. For this is what the sovereign Lord says, I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so I will look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the clouds. I will rescue them from all the places where they are scattered on the days of clouds and darkness. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries. I will bring them into their own land. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel, in the ravines, and in all the settlements in the land. I will tend them in a good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. There they will lie down in good grazing land, and there they will feed in a rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak, but the sleek and strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. As for you, my flock, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will judge between one sheep and another, and between rams and goats. Is it not enough for you to feed on the good pasture? Must you also trample the rest of your pasture with your feet? Is it not enough for you to drink clear water? Must you also muddy the rest with your feet? Must my flock feed on what you have trampled and drink what you have muddied with your feet? Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says to them. See, I myself will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep. Because you shove with flank and shoulder, butting all the weak sheep with your horns until they have driven them away, I will save my flock, and they will no longer be plundered. I will judge between one sheep and another. I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. I will make a covenant of peace with them and rid the land of savage beasts so that they may live in the wilderness and sleep in the forests in safety. I will make them and the places surrounding my hill a blessing. I will send down showers in season. There will be showers of blessing. The trees will yield their fruit, and the ground will yield its crops. The people will be secure in their land. They will know that I am the Lord, when I break the bars of their yoke and rescue them from the hands of those who enslave them. They will no longer be plundered by the nations, nor will wild animals devour them. They will live in safety, and no one will make them afraid. I will provide for them a land renowned for its crops, and they will no longer be victims of famine in the land or bear the scorn of the nations. Then they will know that I, the Lord their God, am with them, and that they, the Israelites, are my people, declares the Sovereign Lord. You are my sheep, the sheep of my pasture. I am your God, declares the Sovereign Lord. Hear the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Susan. So we've got that passage, a key passage of Old Testament prophecy from Ezekiel, which shows, doesn't it, how the leaders of Israel have failed the sheep, God's sheep, the people of Israel, though the people are not without issue either, as you heard. We get in verse 2, "Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who take care only of yourselves." And God's flock has bad leaders who harm and hurt his people. And so God says in that chapter, doesn't he, that he's going to judge and remove them, and that God will send someone to rescue them. I myself, verse 11, will search for my sheep and look after them. He'll restore them. And in verses 23 and 24 we read, "I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken." Failed shepherds, failing the sheep, God's going to intervene, and he's going to give them a servant, David. It's obviously not going to be David, because David's already been and gone at this point, but so it's someone like David, someone in the line of David, who will come and will shepherd the sheep, lead the sheep, save the sheep. All right. So you've got your mind now firmly in the first century. You know how sheep farming works with shepherds and sheep pens and calling by name. That was a common thing. And now you've got a little bit of a window into the kind of things that were in people's mind when it came to thinking about themselves and God and God's leaders as sheep and shepherds. Of course, for the Pharisees, they think themselves to be the good shepherds. But Jesus is saying, no, you're carrying on a strong tradition of Israelite shepherding of God's people where you are failing. You're leading the people astray. So what does it mean for Jesus to be, as he says in chapter 10 of John's Gospel, the gate for the sheep in verse 7 and the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep in verse 11? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it, that as we see in chapter 9 of John's Gospel with that whole story of the spiritual blindness of the Pharisees, that the Pharisees are false shepherds. These are men who've gone around to take the position of leadership of God's people, but they're not doing a good job. It was clearly obvious when they harassed this blind man for receiving the grace of God with that healing miracle. Jesus, however, is the one who's come to be both the gate and the shepherd, the one who protects God's people and allows true leaders in. The Pharisees are illegitimate leaders, ultimately because Jesus is not the one who has let them into the pen. The Pharisees are thieves and robbers, which is why the people are listening to Jesus and not them. That's why the Pharisees are so worried about Jesus, because of his appeal to the crowds. He's a threat to their illegitimate power. He's the true shepherd, and his sheep know his voice. Unlike the thieves and robbers, the true shepherd leads and guides his sheep into fullness of life. John 10:10, A thief comes only to steal, kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. You see, whether it's the Pharisees or anyone else who's not leading us into the ways of Jesus, the end point of that, of following those leaders, is always misery, being stolen, killed and destroyed. Because thieves, false teachers, people like the Pharisees, they don't care about you and me. They care only about themselves. That was the condemnation that happened in Ezekiel 34, wasn't it? But Jesus is not like that. He's not in it for status and power and control. He doesn't need you to make him look good. He's the true shepherd who brings fullness of life. What does that look like? Fullness of life is living with a shepherd who is for you, who will die for you, who wants ultimately what's best for you. Because if you follow or live for anything or anyone other than Jesus, the true shepherd, life is always going to come up short. All those other things are thieves, false leaders. Anything or anyone else other than Jesus is robbing, destroying, and leading you towards death. But Jesus brings fullness. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. It's a foreshadowing, isn't it, of what Jesus has come to do, how he ultimately brings the fullness of life. He dies on the cross to pay the price for our sin. He deals with the problem of our sin and our separation from God and enables us by his death to truly be God's sheep. It's a wonderful thing that Jesus has done for us. But fullness of life doesn't stop there with Jesus' death for us. Jesus also protects us, we read in verses 12 and 13. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. See, Jesus not only dies for us so that we can have fullness of life, but he keeps us safe when we follow him. When we allow him to lead us, we can know that we are not in danger. Because on the cross, when Jesus laid his life down for us as his sheep, he defeated not only sin, but Satan too. Jesus has died for his sheep, and Jesus will protect his sheep. It's the true definition of servant leadership. It couldn't be more different from the kind of leadership the Pharisees were doing that was seeking to use the people for their own position and status. Jesus puts his sheep before himself as he goes to the cross to die, to deal with sin, to deal with the power of Satan, and to bring us into relationship with God. He dies for us, he protects us, and he knows us. Verse 14 and 15, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for my sheep. It's remarkable, isn't it, what the good shepherd of the sheep will do. Not only is Jesus willing to die for us, but he's willing to do that even when he knows us. So I think there's two things about this bit that kind of stun me. Because if you knew me, you wouldn't die for me. I guarantee it. You just think, it's not worth it. He's done too much wrong. He said too many silly things. I'm not dying for that guy. He deserves it. And that's actually true for all of us, isn't it? And yet, Jesus knows us, and he knows all of that, and he still dies for us. It's remarkable. But more than that, when we follow Jesus, we're invited, and this is the second part of, I think, what Jesus is describing here. It's an invitation when Jesus calls us as his sheep and calls himself a shepherd who knows us. It's an invitation into real, true, and personal relationship. See, we're not following some sort of distant shepherd, some sort of abstract king. We're following a king who really, truly knows us and loves us. You think when King Charles next comes to Australia, our king, and you might have a chance to meet him somewhere, and you'll bow, and you'll know a lot about him, but he will know absolutely nothing about you. And he might smile and say hello, but that's it. But the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords and the shepherd of our sheep, Jesus, if it was him that we were bowing before, he would know you, know everything about you, and he loved you, and he died for you. That's the king we're following. A king who we have a real relationship with, a true relationship with, even when we don't deserve it. That is what it means to have fullness of life. A king, a sheep, a shepherd who dies for us, a sheep who protects us, a shepherd who protects us, a shepherd who knows us, and a shepherd who will find us. Verse 16, I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. Of course, in the immediate context, I think Jesus is referring here to the fact that he's still in his very much Jewish stage of his ministry, and God's plan is going to be that through Jesus, all nations are going to be joined together by Jesus in worshipping God through the Messiah, through Jesus. But it remains true today that Jesus is calling sheep into his pen. He's calling you, he's calling me. He's calling our friends and family, our neighbours and our enemies. Maybe he's even calling you here today. Maybe you're not in the pen. Maybe you don't know his voice yet. Maybe you've got no idea what you're doing and you feel like you've been wandering around all alone. Jesus' invitation to you is to hear his voice and to join us in the pen, to have a king who would die for you, a king who will protect you, a king who will know you, and a king who has found you. And when you respond to someone like that, to Jesus, the shepherd of our sheep, our great king, then we experience life in all its fullness and enjoy all the freedoms that come from knowing Jesus. For Jesus is our good shepherd. We all need a leader. We all need someone to follow. And the world offers us all sorts of alternatives. Some we chase after, some sneak into our lives and take over without us really realising. But there's only one leader who knows us, who loves us, who's willing to die for us, and who will protect us. And that's Jesus. So do you know his voice? Are you in his pen? Will you respond to his call today to follow him? Amen.